My grandson found an old envelope. He asked, "Is my grandfather still alive?" After that, nothing was ever the same again. It was one of those bright mornings where the sunlight fell over my big old house like honey, thick, golden, and warm. My home sits up on a rise, white pillars out front, windows tall as soldiers, and a roof that always seemed to reach too far into the sky. After my husband passed, I kept it just as he left it. Maybe it was too big for me alone, but I couldn't bear to leave it. Every creak of the floor still carried his footsteps, or so it felt to me. That morning I had decided it was time to tackle the roof. Lord knows the shingles had been gathering moss, and the gutters were stuffed with autumn leaves that rattled whenever the wind blew. I could have hired someone, of course. Heavens, I've had more money than I know what to do with since selling my husband's company. But there are some things you just want to do yourself. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was my way of proving I still had strength in me, even at my age. My grandson Daniel was with me, my curious little helper, 9 years old and full of questions. He had begged me to let him climb up, and though I hesitated, I couldn't say no. I tied a rope around his waist and secured it to the chimney, my heart jumping every time he leaned too close to the edge. He chattered away the whole time, asking about birds, clouds, and whether his grandpa had ever fallen off the roof while fixing shingles. "No, darling," I laughed, brushing away some leaves. "Your grandpa was steady as they come. He wasn't afraid of heights." Daniel squinted, peering into a corner where a tile jutted loose. "Grandma," he called, "there's something here. Look." I leaned over, expecting maybe a bird's nest or a squirrel's stash. Instead, tucked between the tiles, wrapped in a plastic sleeve to protect it from the weather, was an envelope. My heart gave a strange thump. It wasn't the sort of thing you find on a rooftop, not after years of rain and snow. Daniel scrambled closer, his little fingers prying it free. The envelope was yellowed at the edges, but carefully sealed, as if whoever placed it there wanted it safe. Across the front, neat looping letters spelled out words I didn't recognize. French. "Grandma, what does it say?" Daniel's eyes were wide, his freckles glowing under the sun. I shook my head, frowning at the foreign script. "I don't know, sweetheart. French, maybe. Let's see what's inside." With my fingers trembling, I tore it open. A photograph slid out, catching the light like a shard of glass. My breath caught in my throat. It was him. My husband. My James. Sitting at a small round table outside a Paris café, sunlight on his face, a cup of coffee in front of him, and a croissant half broken on the plate. His shoulders were as straight as I remembered, his hair just beginning to gray, his expression calm, almost amused. He looked alive. Not just alive, real, warm, present, as if the photograph had captured him that very morning. But it couldn't be. Because James had died in 2011. I was the one who identified the body after the accident. I had stood at the funeral, veil pulled low, my hands folded tightly to keep from trembling. I had wept until my eyes swelled shut. I had felt the weight of widowhood settle heavy on my chest. With shaking fingers, I turned the photograph over. There in plain ink was a date. August 15, 2012. A year after his death. I felt my knees weaken, though I was still perched on the rooftop. Daniel was watching me, concern wrinkling his little face. I forced myself to breathe, to stay steady. The shingles swam beneath my hands. "Grandma." His voice was soft. Why does it look like Grandpa?" The world seemed to tilt. The warm sunlight felt cold on my skin. My husband, gone for over a year, was staring back at me from Paris. Alive. I pressed the photograph to my chest, though it burned like fire. My mind screamed for logic, for reason. A trick, perhaps. A mistake. A forgery. But my heart knew the slope of his shoulders, the way he held a cup, the quiet strength in his jaw. It was him. I could still smell the flowers from his funeral. I could still hear the priest reading over the casket. And yet here he was, laughing quietly in a café across the ocean. "Grandma," Daniel whispered again. "Is he alive?" I couldn't answer. "Not yet." The envelope fluttered in my hands, the French words mocking me with their mystery. My whole world had been built on his absence, on the tragedy of losing him. I had mourned him, sold his company for a staggering sum, moved on, or at least tried to. But that photograph told another story, one I wasn't ready to face. And for the first time in my long life, I was afraid not of death but of the truth. Daniel was the first to break the silence. His little hand tugged at my sleeve, his eyes wide with the kind of honesty only a child can hold. "Grandma," he asked softly, "how can Grandpa be alive if we went to his funeral?" The words pierced me sharper than any blade. My throat tightened. For a moment I couldn't speak at all. That photograph lay heavy in my lap, burning through my palms. I looked at James's familiar face in the picture. His smile, his hands wrapped around the porcelain coffee cup, and all I could hear was the crunch of gravel beneath the tires of the hearse the day we buried him. I don't know, darling," I whispered at last. My voice cracked, the truth too large to swallow. Daniel's brow furrowed as he tried to make sense of it. "But Grandma, you told me he went to heaven." My heart clenched. Yes, I had told him that. I had whispered it to him as he cried on my lap after the funeral, both of us broken in our own ways. I had promised him that Grandpa was watching over us. And I believed it until now. "I thought he did, sweetheart," I said, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "I truly did." Daniel peered down at the photograph again. Maybe it's a trick? Maybe someone just made it to look like him? The innocence in his question gave me a small measure of hope. Yes, perhaps it was only some cruel trick. Perhaps my mind, still tender with grief, was imagining details that weren't there. But even as I told myself this, I knew deep down that it was no trick. No forgery could capture the way James always leaned slightly to his right when he sat. No artist could recreate that half smile, the one he only wore when he was lost in thought. I swallowed hard. "We don't know yet, Daniel." He frowned. "But if it is him, why didn't he come home? Why didn't he tell us?" My chest tightened. His questions were too sharp, too true. I had been avoiding them myself, but out of the mouth of a child, they struck with unbearable force. Why hadn't James come home? Why hadn't he told me? Why had I stood by his coffin, sobbing into my veil, if he was still walking the streets of Paris a year later? "I don't know," I admitted, my voice so soft I wasn't sure he heard me. For a moment Daniel said nothing. He just looked at me with those clear, earnest eyes, as though searching my face for answers I didn't have. Finally he whispered, "Grandma, were we wrong? Did we bury the wrong person?" I couldn't breathe. Memories of that awful day came rushing back. The phone call, the officer's solemn face, the twisted wreckage of James's car. I remembered the sterile smell of the morgue, the weight of my son's arm around me as I gazed upon a body that was battered and broken. But still I had believed my husband's. No, it hadn't been a mistake. I had seen enough. And yet, what if grief had blinded me? What if I had been too eager to believe, too desperate for closure? What if? The thought made me dizzy. Daniel climbed closer and wrapped his arms around me. His little voice shook when he asked, "Grandma, is Grandpa a ghost?" I almost laughed, though it caught in my throat. A ghost. That might have been easier to accept. But ghosts don't eat croissants and drink coffee in Paris cafes. Ghosts don't leave dates written on the back of photographs. "No, darling," I said finally, though my own conviction faltered. "He's not a ghost." Daniel leaned his cheek against my shoulder. "Then where is he?" I had no answer. That night, after Daniel went home with his mother, I sat alone in my bedroom, The photograph spread out before me on the quilt James and I had bought on a trip to Vermont. The house was quiet, but my mind screamed with memories. The crash, the funeral, the endless nights of loneliness. I remembered selling the company, walking into that sleek office full of strangers and signing papers worth more than I could fathom. $250 million, that was the figure. More money than I ever dreamed of, though it had meant nothing without him. I thought of how quickly everything had been settled. Too quickly, perhaps. His company, his legacy, wrapped up and sold as though it were nothing more than a piece of furniture. Could it all have been arranged? Could he have wanted it this way? No. I shook my head. It was madness to even think such things. But the photograph on my lap told a story I could no longer deny. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window, staring out into the night. The trees whispered in the wind, shadows sliding across the lawn. For the first time since his death, I felt not just grief but doubt. Had my entire life for the past year been a lie? I thought of Daniel's words. How can Grandpa be alive? It was the same question that now consumed me. And in the silence of my empty room, I realized I could no longer rest until I found the answer. I didn't tell anyone else about the photograph. Not my children, not my neighbors, not even my bridge partners who always pry into everything. I tucked it into the drawer of my bedside table, underneath a stack of old letters James once wrote me back when he was traveling for business. I told myself I was protecting the family, sparing them from confusion, but the truth was I was protecting myself. I wasn't ready for their questions, their disbelief, or their pity. Because what could I even say? Your father may not be dead. I may have buried a stranger. I may have been living a lie. No, I couldn't bear to hear those words out loud. But hiding it didn't silence it. At night, when the house was still, the photograph haunted me. I'd lie awake, the ceiling fan spinning lazy circles above me, and see his face in the café, sunlight soft across his shoulders. Sometimes I'd imagine him turning toward the camera, his eyes catching mine, as if he knew this image would reach me one day. Other nights I replayed the funeral in my mind, the polished mahogany casket, the priest's steady voice, the roses red and heavy laid across the lid. I remembered the press of people's hands on mine, the murmured condolences that never touched the ache in my chest. It had all felt final, absolute. And yet now a single photograph unraveled it all. I couldn't escape the thought. If James was alive, then what had I buried? The question gnawed at me, left me restless and sharp. I started snapping at the gardeners, fussing over the maids, even criticizing Daniel when he chewed too loudly at lunch. I didn't mean to, but my nerves were raw. Every corner of the house seemed filled with James's ghost. Not the comforting sort, but the mocking kind, whispering that I didn't know the truth. One evening I poured myself a glass of wine, something I rarely do, and wandered into James's old study. I hadn't touched much in there since his passing. The shelves were still lined with his leather-bound business journals, his pens neatly arranged in their holder, his chair tucked under the desk like he'd only stepped out for a moment. I sat down in it, the leather cool against my back, and ran my fingers across the blotter. For a moment I almost felt him there. And I whispered into the silence, "Why, James? If you're alive, why didn't you come home?" The study, of course, gave me no answer. Just the quiet tick of the mantel clock. The money weighed on me too. $250 million. That was what I'd walked away with after selling his company. I hadn't needed it, not really. I lived comfortably before, and I lived more than comfortably now. I bought myself a new car, though I hardly drove it. I had staff to take care of the house, though most days I still cleaned the kitchen myself. The truth is, wealth doesn't fill the empty side of the bed, doesn't soften the silence at breakfast. But it struck me now, in the wake of that photograph, that money was part of the mystery. I had sold the company so easily, almost too easily. His competitors had paid, signed the papers, and disappeared from my life. I hadn't questioned it. Grief makes you blind. But maybe James had wanted it that way. Maybe the sale wasn't just business, it was cover. The thought chilled me. I began carrying the photograph everywhere, tucked in my purse between my wallet and my lipstick. I told myself I might need it, but truthfully, I just couldn't bear to be apart from it. More than once, I slipped it out while sitting in the garden, tracing the edges with trembling fingers. His eyes, his smile, the cup of coffee. Proof that I wasn't crazy. At night, the questions chased me. If James was alive, who else knew? Was the accident staged? Was I in danger for knowing? Or had I already been in danger all along? Sleep became a stranger. I'd wander the halls at 2 in the morning, my slippers whispering across the marble floors. Sometimes I'd find myself in the kitchen, staring at the clock, waiting for dawn as if the sun might bring clarity. Other times, I'd sit in James's armchair and clutch the photograph to my chest, whispering prayers I wasn't sure anyone heard. I wanted desperately to confide in someone, but who? My children had their own lives, their own families. They'd think I'd gone senile, chasing shadows. My friends would gossip. And Daniel, my sweet boy, already knew too much. He had asked the question that would not leave me. How can Grandpa be alive? And so I bore it alone. But as the days dragged on, the silence grew unbearable. I knew I couldn't rest until I had an answer. And I had the means. I had the means. $250 million buys more than houses and cars. It buys answers. I looked again at the French writing on the envelope. My French was rusty, but I could recognize enough to see it wasn't gibberish. It was real. Someone had gone to the trouble of writing it, wrapping it, and tucking it away for me to find. It wasn't chance. It was a message. And I intended to find out what it meant. The photograph stayed with me, hidden in my purse like a live coal. Every time my fingers brushed against it, my heart skipped. I was carrying a secret heavier than gold. Nights gave me no peace, mornings no relief. By then, I had convinced myself that silence was no longer an option. If James was alive, or if someone wanted me to believe he was, I needed proof beyond my own eyes. That's how I found myself sitting at my kitchen table with the laptop open, the glow of the screen lighting my tired face. I typed the words slowly. French Embassy in the United States. Now, I'm no stranger to handling matters on my own. After James's death, I signed documents worth more than my wildest childhood dreams. I sat across from lawyers in polished shoes and shook hands with businessmen whose eyes never met mine. I kept my voice steady, even when my knees shook under the table. But this felt different. This was personal, raw. My hands trembled as I composed the email. I explained as simply as I could that I had found a photograph with French writing on the envelope, dated August 15, 2012, showing my deceased husband sitting in a Paris café. I asked if they could verify its authenticity. I attached the scanned image with care, my heart pounding as I hit send. Afterward, I just sat there staring at the screen. The house around me was silent, the ticking clock loud enough to make me flinch. I half expected an answer immediately, though I knew better. Governments don't move quickly for widows with broken hearts. Still, hope flickered. The waiting began that very moment, and it was agony. The first day, I busied myself with chores, trimming the roses, polishing the silver, even sweeping the porch like I hadn't done in years. Anything to keep from checking my inbox every half hour. The maids whispered that I seemed restless. They weren't wrong. At night, I wandered into James's study again. His presence lingered there like cigar smoke. I sat at his desk and whispered questions into the air. Were you in Paris, James? Did you leave me behind? Was I just a pawn in some cruel game? No answer came, of course. Only the low groan of the old house settling. On the second day, doubt began gnawing. What if they dismissed me? What if they thought I was some silly old widow chasing ghosts? Worse yet, what if they confirmed the photo was a forgery? I didn't know which outcome frightened me more. That afternoon, I found myself staring out the window, watching the gardener trim hedges. Life outside moved on so easily, so indifferently, while my own heart was trapped in a cage of uncertainty. I made tea, but it grew cold on the saucer. I tried to knit, but the yarn tangled hopelessly. My mind returned again and again to that café scene. I could almost hear the clink of porcelain cups, the murmur of French voices, the scrape of a chair against cobblestone. Was James really there? Or had grief played a trick so convincing I could no longer tell dream from reality? By evening, I sat alone in the parlor, staring at the fire I hadn't bothered to light. The wealth I carried, the mansions, the accounts, the jewels locked in velvet cases, felt like a mockery. What good is fortune when your very life might be a lie? That night I lay awake listening to the ticking clock, each second dragging like an anchor chain. I thought of Daniel, my sweet boy, and his question, "How can Grandpa be alive?" Perhaps I thought he was the only one who would believe me. Children see truth more clearly than grown-ups with their walls of logic. But I kept the secret still. Not yet. Not until I knew. When morning came, I found myself once again at the computer. I opened my email with trembling fingers. Nothing. Closed it. Opened it again 10 minutes later. Still nothing. The day stretched on endlessly, each hour mocking me with silence. I tried to distract myself by driving into town, but even among the bustle of shops and cafes, I felt detached, as though I were drifting in a fog only I could see. The world looked ordinary, but nothing was ordinary anymore. That evening, I set the photograph on the table and studied it under the lamp. James looked so solid, so alive, the faintest smile tugging at his lips as though he were holding a secret of his own. My hand brushed over the date on the back. August 15, 2012. That was what I had clung to, cold, hard numbers, proof that this wasn't just an old memory resurfacing. I whispered again, "Where are you, James?" 2 days had never felt so long in my entire life. When the reply finally came, I almost didn't hear the ding of the notification. My hand shook as I clicked. The message was brief, written in the crisp language of officials. They had examined the photograph carefully. It was authentic. No signs of manipulation. No forgery. No trick. Real. I sat there frozen, staring at the words. For a long while I didn't breathe. It was real. James had been alive a year after I buried him. My world tilted on its axis. Everything I had known, his death, my grief, the funeral, the sale of his company, suddenly felt like smoke, insubstantial and shifting. The embassy had given me no explanation, no comfort, just the stark truth. The photograph was genuine. And with that, my life as I thought I knew it was over. The words on the screen might as well have been carved in stone. After careful analysis, we confirmed that the photograph is authentic. There are no indications of manipulation or forgery. The image is genuine. I read it once, twice, 10 times, each repetition heavier than the last. My heart thumped like a drum in a funeral march. Genuine. Real. No mistake, no illusion. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the walls of my kitchen. They seemed to press in around me, suffocating. The ticking of the clock grew unbearable. Each second a cruel reminder that time was moving forward while my world spun backward. James had been alive. Alive in August of 2012. A full year after I had buried him. I covered my mouth with my hand, but the sob still escaped, jagged and raw. I hadn't cried like that in years, not even at the funeral. That day I'd been numb, frozen, too stunned to let the tears fall. But now the dam broke. My shoulders shook, my chest heaved, and still I couldn't stop. For a long while I just sat there in the empty house, crying like a girl who'd lost her first love. When the tears finally slowed, I pressed my palms flat on the table. My rings glinted under the light, heavy and cold, reminders of the fortune James had left me. A fortune I now realized wasn't a gift, it was a bargain. A price for silence. 'Cause that's what it was, wasn't it? A carefully orchestrated performance. His death, the funeral, the company's sale. It hadn't been tragedy. It had been strategy. The realization made me dizzy. I stood and wandered into the parlor. The portrait of James hung above the mantel, painted years ago, his expression steady and proud. I stared at it, whispering, "Why, James? Why did you leave me like that? Why did you let me think you were gone?" The painted eyes offered no answer. I thought of the casket, the funeral, the priest's words. All of it a lie. Had everyone known but me? Were the children complicit? My knees nearly buckled at the thought. No, surely not. My children had mourned too, hadn't they? Unless grief itself had been staged. No. I pushed that thought away. My children were innocent. This was between James and his enemies, whoever they were. Still, the betrayal burned. I had lain awake so many nights in a bed that felt too large, whispering his name into the darkness, clutching his pillow until dawn. I had walked through rooms that felt hollow without him. I had signed away his life's work for $250 million, believing it was the only way forward. And all that time he had been alive, eating croissants in Paris cafes while I drowned in grief. The anger rose hot in my chest, sharp enough to scorch away the tears. "Damn you, James," I whispered. "Damn you for making me your widow when I wasn't." I wanted to tear the photograph in half, to burn it in the fireplace and scatter the ashes. But my hands wouldn't do it. I held it instead, clutching it to my chest as though it were both poison and cure. That night I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I wandered the house like a restless ghost, touching the back of his chair, running my hands across his desk, staring at the closet where his suit still hung. Every shadow seemed to whisper. By dawn, I sat at the window with a blanket around my shoulders, staring at the pale light creeping across the lawn. My reflection in the glass startled me. I looked older, worn, as though the truth had carved new lines overnight. But underneath the grief, the shock, and the anger, a new feeling stirred: resolve. I would not sit idly by while the truth lay across the ocean. I would not remain in this mansion, haunted by lies, while James lived and breathed in Paris. I had the means, the money, the freedom. For once in my life I was unbound. I rose from the chair, the decision as solid as stone. I would go to Paris. I would find James with my own two eyes, and I would demand answers. By mid-morning I was pulling suitcases from the closet. I packed slowly at first, then faster, my hands steadier with every folded blouse and tucked away scarf. I filled the cases with clothes but also with courage, with the remnants of a life built on lies. On the dresser, I placed the photograph one last time beneath the lamp. James sat there still, his smile faint, his eyes unreadable. I lifted it gently and slid it into the pocket of my handbag. "You won't hide from me anymore," I whispered. The decision was final. The path laid out. Paris. Answers. Truth. And James. When I told the family I was leaving for France, I didn't give them a reason. I simply said I needed time away. A trip to clear my head. They nodded politely, perhaps thinking it was the sort of thing widows do when the house grows too quiet. None of them pressed, though I caught the worry in my daughter's eyes. Only Daniel lingered by the door as I zipped my suitcase shut. He fiddled with the handle of his backpack before asking, "Grandma, are you going to find Grandpa?" My hand froze on the zipper. I looked at him, my sweet boy, so much sharper than the adults around him. "Daniel," I said softly, kneeling so we were eye level, "I'm going to find the truth." He chewed his lip. "Can I come with you?" Oh, how my heart ached. The thought of his small hand in mine on those cobblestone Paris streets almost made me say yes. But danger shadowed this journey, and I could not risk him. I shook my head. "Not this time, darling. Some roads Grandma has to walk alone." His eyes filled, but he nodded. "Bring him back if you can." I kissed his forehead. holding his face between my palms. I'll do my best. By the next morning, I was boarding a plane. The airport smelled of coffee and jet fuel, a scent I've always found oddly comforting. As I settled into the first-class seat, something I never would have indulged in years ago, I thought about James. How many times had he flown to Europe for business? How many trips had he made under the guise of duty, when in truth, he might have been weaving the threads of a secret life? The engines roared, the plane tilted skyward, and with it my heart. I was leaving behind my old life, my familiar ghosts, and stepping into a new story I hadn't chosen but couldn't ignore. The flight stretched long, hours ticking past as clouds drifted below. I tried to sleep, but rest wouldn't come. Instead, I stared at the photograph in my lap, the café table, the croissant, his smile. Over and over I studied it, as if the paper itself might whisper an answer if I gazed long enough. Finally, the captain announced our descent into Paris. My stomach fluttered. The city spread beneath us, gray rooftops dotted with chimneys, the Seine winding like a silver ribbon. For a moment I felt like a girl again, stepping into a dream. But this was no dream. At Charles de Gaulle, I moved through customs with a calm face, though my hands shook. The air smelled faintly of bread and perfume, foreign and familiar all at once. A driver with my name on a placard guided me into a sleek black car. The streets blurred past, stone buildings, flower boxes, narrow alleys alive with voices. At the hotel, a grand old place with red velvet chairs in the lobby, I checked in under my own name. Perhaps foolish, but I was too tired to invent lies. I tipped the bellboy, unpacked only the essentials, and stood at the window staring out at the sprawl of Paris. Somewhere out there, James was breathing the same air. The weight of that thought pressed on me until I nearly couldn't stand it. The next morning, I took the first step toward finding him. Money makes many doors open, even those locked to ordinary seekers. I placed a discreet call to a private investigator whose name had been whispered by an old acquaintance. His English was crisp, his tone businesslike. We met in a small café near the Luxembourg Gardens. He was a thin man with sharp eyes and a leather notebook he flipped open the moment he sat down. I slid the photograph across the table. He studied it a long while, tapping his pen. "You are certain this is your husband?" he asked. I would stake my soul on it. My voice trembled. He nodded slowly. "Very well. I will find him." The words sent a chill racing down my spine. As if it were that simple, to track a ghost, to peel back the veil of lies. Still, something in his confidence steadied me. "Be discreet," I urged. "If he has enemies, I cannot let them know I'm searching." His thin lips curved faintly. "Discretion is my trade, madam." We agreed on his fee, generous, but money meant little now. He rose, tucked the photograph into his notebook, and left with a bow. I lingered, staring at the empty chair he'd left behind, wondering if I'd just entrusted my life to a stranger who might vanish with my hope. The next days were torture. I roamed the streets of Paris aimlessly, trailing through flower markets and down narrow lanes where the scent of bread drifted from bakeries. I should have been enchanted. Once I had dreamed of James and I retiring here, sipping wine on a balcony as the Eiffel Tower glittered in the distance. But now every cobblestone felt heavy beneath my feet, every face in the crowd a question mark. Was James among them? Was he watching me even now? At night, I returned to my hotel room, my nerves stretched taut. I kept the curtains drawn, my suitcase packed by the door. Each ring of the phone made my heart jolt. On the 7th day, the call came. His voice was calm, measured. "Madam, I have found him. I will send you the address." My hand shook so badly I nearly dropped the receiver. "You're certain? There is no mistake." And then before I could ask another word, the line went dead. I stared at the phone in silence, a cold dread curling through me. He had given me the truth. And then he had disappeared. The address arrived in an envelope slipped under my hotel room door the next morning. No note, no explanation, just a single piece of paper with a street name and number scrawled in sharp handwriting. My pulse quickened the moment I saw it. I expected to feel relief, but instead, a cold unease settled in my stomach. The detective hadn't called. He hadn't met me face to face. He had simply vanished. I tried phoning the number he had given me on our first meeting, but it rang endlessly. No answer. By evening, it went straight to silence, as though the line no longer existed. The realization chilled me. He was gone. Whether by choice or by force, I didn't know. That night, I sat on the edge of my hotel bed with the address clutched in my hands. The city outside hummed with its usual life: car horns, laughter, the faint melody of an accordion somewhere on the street. But inside, the walls felt too close. Had I dragged an innocent man into something dangerous? Had someone silenced him because of what he'd discovered? I thought of James. If the detective could find him in just a week, surely others could as well. Whoever had driven my husband into hiding must have known I would come searching eventually. Perhaps they were watching me even now. I locked the door, checked it twice, and drew the curtains tight. But sleep did not come. Instead, I sat upright in the armchair by the window, staring at the slip of paper. The address seemed to glow in the dim light of the lamp, a promise and a threat all at once. By dawn, my mind was made up. If the detective had disappeared, then I would follow the trail myself. I dressed carefully, choosing a plain skirt and blouse that wouldn't draw attention, and tucked the photograph into my handbag. My reflection in the mirror startled me. Pale face, tired eyes, a woman who looked far older than she had when she left America. Secrets age you, I thought. Lies weigh you down. I left the hotel discreetly, avoiding the gaze of the concierge. The streets of Paris were cool and gray that morning, mist curling around the chimneys. I hailed a cab and handed the driver the slip of paper. He glanced at it, then at me, and gave the smallest nod before pulling into traffic. The ride felt endless. Each turn, each stoplight, seemed to draw me deeper into a labyrinth I wasn't sure I wanted to enter. My hands clutched my bag so tightly my knuckles whitened. Finally, we arrived in a quieter part of the city, where narrow lanes wound between shuttered shops and old stone houses. The driver pulled up to the curb and gestured. "This is it," he said in thickly accented English. I paid him and stepped out, my shoes clicking against the cobblestone. The street was nearly silent, save for the distant hum of a scooter. I turned toward the building the detective had marked. It was unremarkable: 3 stories of pale stone, shutters painted a faded green, a small iron balcony on the second floor. A curtain stirred faintly in the breeze, and my heart jolted. Was someone watching? I stood there, frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down. This was it, the place where answers might wait. But fear coiled tighter around my ribs. Why had the detective vanished right after giving me this? Why had he not met me himself? The thought struck like lightning. Perhaps this was a trap. I backed away, my breath quickening. The street seemed too quiet, the shadows too long. Every doorway looked like a hiding place, every shuttered window a pair of watching eyes. I forced myself to keep walking, as though I belonged there, as though I were nothing more than a tourist admiring the architecture. But my mind screamed with questions. Was James inside that building? Or had someone lured me here to silence me too? By the time I reached the end of the street, my knees were weak. I ducked into a small café and sat near the window, trying to steady myself with a cup of bitter coffee. The steam curled into my face, grounding me in its warmth, but my hands still trembled. I unfolded the photograph again, laying it beside the cup. His face looked back at me, calm, steady, unchanged. The man I had loved, the man I had buried, the man who might be only a few doors away. I whispered, "Where are you, James? And why won't you let me find you?" The detective's disappearance was no coincidence. Of that I was certain. Someone had warned him off, or worse. Which meant whatever truth lay behind that address was dangerous enough to erase a man from the city of Paris without leaving a trace. I wrapped the paper carefully and tucked it back into my bag. I wasn't ready to step inside that building. Not yet. But I knew one thing for certain. The walls of lies were closing in. And whether I liked it or not, I was already caught in the center of them. And that was when I felt it, someone's presence behind me. A voice spoke low, so close it startled me. Margaret. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. He was there. James. My James. For a moment I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. He stood in the fading light, hands shoved into his coat pockets, his hair grayer, his frame leaner. But it was him. The curve of his jaw, the eyes I had memorized, the faint crease at his brow that always deepened when he worried. I gasped, stumbling back a step, clutching the wall for support. No. This isn't possible. It's me, he said gently, his voice breaking. It's really me. The world tilted. My knees threatened to give way. I clutched my bag tighter, pressing it against my chest as if it could shield me from the truth standing in front of me. You, my throat burned. I buried you. I saw your coffin lowered into the ground. His eyes flickered with pain. I know. Tears stung my eyes, hot and sudden. How could you let me do that? How could you leave me like that? He took a step closer, then stopped as if he feared I might bolt. I never wanted to hurt you. Hurt me. My voice rose, jagged and raw. Do you have any idea what the last year has been? The nights I lay awake alone? The way I stood in our house, listening to the silence where your voice should have been? His shoulders sagged. I know, he said softly, and I will explain everything. But not here. It isn't safe. Safe. The word cut through me. It matched the fear that had wrapped around me since the detective disappeared. Whoever had forced James into hiding. They hadn't vanished. They were still watching, still close. But my anger was louder than fear. I stepped toward him, close enough to touch his arm, though I didn't. My fingers trembled at my side. Do you have any idea what you've done to me? To our children? To Daniel? At the mention of our grandson, his face broke. His hand rose, then dropped. I thought I was protecting you. All of you. I wanted to scream, to strike him, to demand answers. But instead I just stood there, staring at him, torn in two. Part of me longed to run into his arms, to feel the solidity of him, to know this wasn't a dream. The other part wanted to recoil, to spit at the betrayal, the lie that had wrapped itself around my life. He lowered his voice. Please, come with me. Just for tonight. Let me tell you the truth. The street around us was quiet, but I felt eyes everywhere. My pulse pounded in my ears. I swallowed hard. If you lie to me again, James, I swear. I won't, he said, his voice steady. I never should have left you in the dark. But tonight you'll know everything. Silence stretched between us. I could hear my own ragged breath, the distant sound of footsteps on stone. Slowly I nodded. Not because I forgave him. Not yet. But because I had lived too long with questions, and the answers, no matter how painful, were standing right in front of me. James reached for the door, pushed it open, and stepped aside for me to enter. I hesitated, my heart hammering, then crossed the threshold into the unknown. Behind me, the door clicked shut, sealing me into a world I thought had ended with his death. And in that moment I knew my life would never be the same again. The apartment was dim, its curtains drawn tight. The air smelled faintly of tobacco and something older, like books left too long in the sun. James motioned for me to sit, but I stayed standing, my back stiff, my bag clutched like a shield. He closed the door and leaned against it, as if guarding us from the world outside. For a long moment he just looked at me, and I saw the weight of years in his eyes. Margaret, he said quietly, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, But I need you to hear me. I wanted to scream, to demand answers immediately, but my voice came out hoarse. You'd better tell me the truth this time. Every word. He nodded slowly. Every word. He rubbed his hands together as though trying to summon courage, then began. Years before the accident, before that night, I knew I was being watched. My company had grown too powerful too fast. Competitors weren't just competitors anymore. They were enemies. Men who would do anything to destroy me, to take what I built. And they weren't above using family to do it. I felt my stomach twist. You never said a word. Because if I had, you would have lived every day looking over your shoulder, he said. I thought I could handle it myself. For years I did. But then the threats became personal. His voice dropped. They spoke your name, Margaret. They knew our grandchildren. That was when I realized this wasn't business anymore. It was war. I gripped the strap of my bag tighter. So your solution was to die? His eyes closed briefly. My solution was to make them believe I was gone. If they thought I was dead, they'd stop hunting. And if I could ensure the company was sold quickly, at a fraction of its worth, they'd see it as victory. They'd take the prize and move on. And they would leave you, all of you, alone. The words cut deep. Do you have any idea what you put me through? The children. The funeral, James. The grief. The hole you left in our lives. I know, he whispered. I watched from a distance. I saw your pain. It nearly broke me. His voice cracked, and for a moment, the man in front of me wasn't the untouchable businessman I had married, but the boy who once promised to never let me cry. But it was the only way I could protect you. I shook my head, tears burning. Protect me? You shattered me. His shoulders sagged, but his eyes never left mine. Would you rather I had stayed and risked your life? Theirs? The anger in me faltered, tangled with something heavier. Love, grief, and the weight of knowing he believed every word. I sank slowly into the chair he'd motioned to earlier. My knees trembled too much to keep me standing. He sat across from me, hands clasped tightly as though in prayer. When the car accident happened, he continued, it was no accident. It was staged. With help. My breath caught. Help? From who? He hesitated. People I can't name. People who specialize in disappearing men like me. They arranged everything, the wreck, the funeral, even the body. I flinched. Whose body did I bury, James? His eyes fell to the floor. I don't know. And I wish I never had to make you carry that burden. A cold shiver ran down my spine, but I pressed on. So all this time you've been here? Hiding in Paris, sipping coffee while I lived half a life? I wasn't living, he said sharply, almost pleading. I was surviving. Always in the shadows, never safe enough to reach out. Until now. Until I knew the hunt had ended. I searched his face, looking for lies, but found only exhaustion. Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Finally I whispered, why didn't you trust me? Why didn't you let me choose, James? He leaned forward, his voice rough. Because I couldn't risk losing you. If I'd told you, they'd have seen it in your eyes, in your steps. They would have known. And they would have destroyed you. I wanted to stay angry, but the truth in his words sank like stones in my chest. He had stolen my choice, yes. He had broken me. But he had also saved me. And the two truths sat side by side, jagged and cruel. Tears welled, but I didn't look away from him. Do you have any idea how much I still love you? His lips trembled. Enough to come across the world to find me. We sat there, two old fools bound by love and lies, staring at each other across a gulf that had taken years to cross. Finally, I reached into my bag, pulled out the photograph and set it on the table between us. His eyes softened as he looked at it, then back at me. I kept it, I said, because even when I thought you were gone, something in me still believed. And for the first time in years, James reached across the table and took my hand. His grip was warm, steady, alive. And in that touch I felt the truth. He was mine still, in love and in betrayal, in death and in life. I don't know how long we sat there, my hand in his. The years between us, the lies, the grief, they were all still there. But for the first time since that awful funeral I felt whole. James was alive. He had broken me, but he had also returned. The question was, what now? We both knew the world couldn't know. His enemies might be quiet for now, but money and power have long memories. To announce his return would be to invite danger right back into our lives. So we chose secrecy. One by one, in careful whispers, I brought the children and grandchildren to him. Daniel was the first. When he saw James, he didn't cry or shout. He just ran forward and hugged his grandfather tight, as if he'd known all along. My daughter wept in his arms. My son stood frozen, torn between fury and relief. But slowly, one by one, the family accepted the impossible. We gathered in that little Paris apartment, crowded and warm, laughter mingling with tears. We promised to keep the secret safe, to guard this fragile miracle from the outside world. For me, the choice was clear. I packed my things from the hotel and moved into the apartment with him. It wasn't the grand mansion I had left behind, but it was where he was, and that was all I had ever wanted. The days became quiet, simple. We cooked together in the tiny kitchen, strolled the narrow streets hand in hand, sat by the Seine watching the boats drift by. Sometimes I caught him staring at me as though making sure I was real too. Did I forgive him? Not all at once. Some nights, lying beside him, I still woke with anger pressing at my chest. But love has a way of softening sharp edges, and with time the ache dulled. I realized forgiveness wasn't a gift I gave him. It was a gift I gave myself. Our life now is hidden, but it is ours. We don't need the world. We have our family, our laughter, our secrets, and the simple joy of being together again. And in the quiet of our Paris home, I sometimes whisper a prayer of thanks. Not for the lies, not for the years lost, but for the chance to live out the rest of our story side by side. Happily ever after, though not in the way I once imagined. A little battered, a little bruised, but ours nonetheless.